record this. We've already been through that everything that begins to exist has a cause, that there's order, that there are rules, that there are experiences, and those are evidences for God's existence. Talked about the fatality of the cross, the appearances of Jesus to his disciples and others after his death, the commitment of those disciples to them having seen a risen Jesus. And now this one is the testimony of man, is by and large that Jesus was raised from the dead. So, and he goes into Luke here and he says, it's the angel speaking, and it says, "He is not here, but he is risen. Remember how he spoke to you while he was still in Galilee." That's Luke 24:6. And it's basically hey, remember, guys, he said he's not going to be here. Yeah, he's not. So, big shocker, Jesus isn't in the tomb. So he says, at this point, we're prepared to consider the testimony of mankind regarding the resurrection of Jesus. Doing so will demonstrate the centrality of the Christian faith for the flow of human history. First, we have to consider the mark that Jesus left on the earth. Data must be accepted whether one recognizes Jesus as Lord or not, right? So there's a guy named Tom Holland. He's an atheist. He just wrote a book about the impact that Christianity has had on human history. And basically, he says, if it weren't for the outpouring of Christianity into the pagan world in the first century, we would still have things like exposure of infants, and just goes through all these things that, were terrible things that were going on in the first century that aren't going on anymore. And then it says, involved in this will be an analysis of how the citizens of the modern Western world seem to react to the character of Jesus. So second, we'll consider the testimony of the Gospels themselves. Are they reliable? If so, it must be determined whether their testimony is consistent with what early church was proclaiming in its earliest days. And third, we'll consider whether the views of today's skeptical scholars confirm the points we've been addressing throughout the last 3 chapters. And then finally, we'll consider some objections. So there's going to be a lot of good information in this. We might break this up into 2 pieces. I'm not real sure, but we'll move through this and we'll see where we end up. So he says the testimony of world history. Having never traveled far from his birthplace, written a single document, run for political offices, taken a wife, fathered any heirs, or even spoken up for himself in the face of injustice, Jesus is still the most influential human being who has ever been born. Right? That is, almost without a doubt. He's the single most influential. Whether people believe in him as the Messiah or not, people have conformed a lot of their thoughts to his. Right? It says this alone should be enough to leave observers inquiring as to what the life and teaching of the historical Jesus actually were. And whether people are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, atheist, or agnostic, people of every persuasion and cultural origin have attempted to fully explore the story of the man and determine why his influence was so far spread. So, no matter where somebody comes from, they see the impact that his life had on earth, and they want to see why. Why was it so impactful? Why did he have such a change? He continues, he says, even the most venomous and hate-filled opponents of Christ's church find it difficult to speak ill of the man himself. Even though he warned the world of the reality of hell, introduced a view of morality in which even the thoughts of men can be evil, and preached that he alone was the way to obtain everlasting life, people who live contrary to his teachings are wary of doing any violence to his name. Naturally, sinners throughout history, in an attempt to accommodate their own shortcomings, have twisted the words of Jesus to sound as though he was more permissive of unrighteousness than he was. They still find it offensive to disregard him outright. So what was so amazing about this Christ that we find him in a nature that is absolutely unobjectionable? He talks about having spoken in churches. He says, I've often delivered less offensive messages than Jesus, and yet been labeled a hellfire and brimstone preacher by individuals who seem entirely ignorant of his difficult teachings on this matter. Right? He's even been told that Jesus wouldn't have talked about hell, or Jesus would have said he was the only way to heaven, or Jesus wouldn't have said he was the only way to heaven. Such statements not only demonstrate a lack of biblical knowledge, but they also show what many hearers are fully prepared to shoot the messenger while defending its sender. Would it not be easier to simply abandon the teachings of Christ? Indeed, many have, but others find it impossible to treat him in any way other than kingly. Again, we find ourselves asking, what is so impressive about this man that we cannot deny him? His teachings have been dissected by scholars throughout history. What might cause educated men to take his message so seriously that religious and national divisions have resulted from varying interpretation? Even during the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, there were already major churches in Jerusalem, Alexandria, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, and elsewhere, with each community slightly differing on points of theological significance. Now, he's talking about the fact that, everybody has been willing to say, okay, well, we're going to believe this, you go ahead and believe this. And that's fine, right? It's fine that we have varying beliefs on minor things, right? Do I think that a Calvinist, somebody who believes in 5-point Calvinism is saved? Yes. Do I believe in 5-point Calvinism? No. Can we discuss that? Yes, but that's like an in-house discussion, right? Do I think somebody who says Jesus isn't God is saved? No. That's an out-of-house discussion now. But he's talking about there's slightly differing points on the minor things, right? The problem is people took these minor things and they made them major, right? So they had political ramifications. So we've got to make sure that we're keeping the little things as the little things and allowing the big things to be the big things. And he says, rounding out the relevance of Jesus' message to the whole of the human experience, faithful believers who credited Christ with their work made scientific discoveries, began scientific institutions, and established hospitals. Universities began because of Christianity, seeking to form higher education. As a matter of fact, the word university comes from the Latin unis, or one, veritas, truth. One truth. That's what a university is supposed to have. It's supposed to be about going towards one truth. Because we don't really understand how people use Latin, we lose the meanings of things like that. So hospitals were established because of Christians. More hospitals in America started as a result of Christian work than those that didn't. Right? More often than not, a hospital was began by Christians. Yale, even Harvard, Brown, all the Ivy League schools started out as seminaries, places for people to begin to learn who God was, which is kind of crazy to me, because now if you were to go to one of those, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of God talk, with resulting in saved Christians being those who are the ones coming out. Could it be that the message of Jesus is of such importance because the events surrounding his death demonstrate he was speaking the words of the divine? Let us say, could it be that Jesus' message retains its power for us because he is the one person in history of humanity to have passed through the doorway of death, allowed it to shut firmly behind him, and 3 days later walked back through it to explain everything to hundreds of onlookers? Such an idea is often dismissed by skeptics outright. Hard-pressed are we to find many people of sound mind today who claim to have ever encountered someone who has returned from death. Actually, there are a whole bunch of articles on near-death experiences, and they're kind of cool. Lee Strobel wrote a book called "On Case for Miracles," and Gary Habermas, he wrote a book on near-death experiences and miracles and things of that nature. So it's kind of cool that we're getting people who have evidence for their near-death experiences. So it's not just yes, I've been to heaven, but it's a hey, I've got evidence of things that I wouldn't know from while I was quote unquote dying or dead. So I think that's pretty cool. So rejoicing is in order for the faith of the believer. Still, this demonstrates two things. First, it shows that very intelligent people in the Christian faith believe something that seems extremely unlikely. Right? We pretty much believe in the resurrection of Jesus. If we're Christians, I sure hope we do, because if we don't, then we might want to, evaluate whether we're actually a Christian. So there must be some good reason for their acceptance of these teachings. This is not in itself an argument that Jesus rose from the dead. Rather, it's yet another example of how another of the examples we've been considering of how this simple carpenter has impacted learned and unlearned people since the time of his preaching. So he's saying, hey, people have been impacted by this guy, whether all of this is true or not. The question is whether or not it is. And he keeps going, and he says, what if it is true? What if it truly is the case that there is good reason to believe that Jesus lives today? Wouldn't this be utterly life-changing for anyone who recognized such a truth? Obviously, believers take the claims of Christ so seriously, they do more than simply mentally agree with him. They tend to change their lives. And that's why we have testimonies, right? These testimonies are of, how Christ has changed people's lives. Right? This is not to say that they're somehow perfect people. If anybody says they're perfect, they make God to be a liar. But furthermore, they change the way they view the person of Christ. No longer is he just some ancient rabbi of minimal consequence, but he's actually alive. Springing forth from this belief of his present existence, Christians recognize a need to pray to him, thank him for his sacrifice for their sins, and live lives of gratitude. What's more, if his resurrection is evidence that he is the God of Scripture, then believers see him as the object of worship. It's exactly what we see when we look at the position of the church, right? So atheists will point out the difference between, the Baptists and the Pentecostals and the Presbyterians and the you name it, right? They'll point at the differences and say, see, you guys are all different. You guys quibble over little details. Well, those are in-house arguments. We're allowed to have in-house arguments. You just need to ask an atheist which kind of atheist they are for them to realize that, hey, guess what? Not everybody's cut of the same cloth. Yeah. Some atheists mean, I don't believe in God at all. Some mean, well, I don't know if there's a God. Some say, yeah, just lack of belief in God. Mm-hmm. So the true church has recognized Jesus as being the way to salvation and the only hope for reaching the Father. I think that's what it really boils down to. So in Jesus, we find a man the likes of which would have commonly not have been influential, but who has influenced the world for 2,000 years to the extent that his followers have shaped it in amazing ways. They have changed the course of nation, inspired technological advances, devoted their lives to his service, worshipped him as God, come through his teachings as though they were the words of God, and demonstrate that they were willing to die to defend the truth of his message. And so the community of faith has done this because the cultural claim of the Christian faith, namely that Jesus was raised by the Father from the dead. That's central claim. If Jesus is not raised, Paul says, our faith is in vain. Right? So we can pack up and go home if Jesus didn't raise from the dead.
That means you're serving a dead God.
Yeah, exactly. You're serving somebody who's dead, and that doesn't. Why would you do that?
That doesn't
make sense. Yeah. Yet, as we have said, the hope of the believer is misplaced unless Jesus really has done what Christians claim that he has. If he had merely died and remained dead, there is no hope. If Jesus' resurrection did not take place, then his life came to an end as any other man. The ramifications of this are abundant. For not only would this mean that he died, but the city of God, as Augustine says, would become like any other kingdom in history. It would fall to foreign invaders and some other faith, and indeed, if it was built on a lie, then it should. Right? So it means, there's no heaven the way we see it. There's no hell the way we see it. There's no God the way we see him. Right? None of these work well if Jesus indeed did not rise from the dead. So he kind of takes up some parts of the trilemma of C.S. Lewis, who said, Jesus is either, a lunatic, he's Lord, or he's a liar. Those are your three choices. There's no other options, right? He says maybe Jesus was out of his mind, so we're not at a loss for lunatics throughout history who functioned as radical and insane leaders. But, if we look at Jesus through the lens of psychology, it doesn't show that. He showed no signs of insanity. He was still considering what he was doing when he threw over the tables. He planned it out. He didn't have a desire for power. He wanted people to follow him, but even his disciples were disillusioned and did not come to establish an earthly king. That he did not come to establish an earthly kingdom. Right? They were like, "All right, he's going to rule now. We're gonna be at the table with Jesus, and man, it's going to be awesome. We're going to be living the dream. We're going to be living large." Right? His one was a message of peace. He didn't encourage mass suicide, orgies, holy homicide, hatred. Right? He even said that we're to love our enemies. Mm-hmm. Psychologists today would conclude that Jesus was a sane individual. Imagine what it would mean if this were untrue. If it were untrue and Jesus were crazy, he were insane, right? Then, everything that the world has done for 2,000 years would be for naught, right? Everything. And that would be weird if everything that we've done throughout the last 2,000 years has been for nothing. All the improvements in society and things of that, right? Jesus made such a mark on the planet that belief in him is still changing people for the better, as no drug, counselor, or therapy is able to do. No reference for this is needed. Almost everyone knows someone who has altered their way of living because they became a Christian, right? And they changed their entire lifestyle, right? And then he goes through C.S. Lewis's trilemma, and he said, this is what C.S. Lewis wrote. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing people often say about him, that's Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is, we all know somebody who's like, oh yeah, Jesus is a good teacher. He's probably not God though. I've heard that a million times. C.S. Lewis says, this is one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a good teacher. He's either a lunatic on the level of a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He's not left that open for us. He did not intend to. Right? We've got to make a choice. We see that he's not a lunatic, so either Jesus is a liar or he is who he said he was. Right? Often in today's culture, we hear individuals referring to Jesus as good moral teacher. They mean to stay faithful to the idea that he was a good man, but not the God man. It becomes problematic for Lewis in that it does not seem that one can logically say that Jesus was a good man and nothing more. Right? Jesus is either a lunatic if he really thought he was God, a liar if he was trying to deceive men about this, or he was Lord. Right? If he was not a lunatic, which we already saw, right, he either has to be a liar or Lord. If he was not a liar, then he must have been a lunatic or Lord. If he was not Lord, then he must have been a lunatic or liar. Yet none of these possibilities leave the idea of Jesus as simply a good man open to us as a live option. Right? So we really have to look at this and go, is it, is it real? Is it true? So he says what we really have to do is we have to look at the testimonies, right? We have to look at the testimonies of the Gospels. One of the tools for determining history properly is called multiple attestation, meaning multiple people come and they talk about it. For obvious reasons, more witnesses one is able to collect data from, a stronger case can be made that a given event actually occurred. Right? So critics of the Christian message recognize and advocate the use of this principle. Noted scholar who is an agnostic, he calls himself an agnostic on good days and an atheist on not good days. But he's a New Testament scholar. His name is Bart Ehrman. He says, I've repeatedly stressed that a tradition appearing in multiple independent sources has a greater likelihood of being historically reliable than a tradition that appears in only one. If it is found independently in a number of sources, the probability of its being reliable is increased, assuming, of course, that it is contextually credible. Despite the fact that a strong case can be made in favor of the resurrection merely from 1 Corinthians 15, historians find multiple attestation in the Gospels. Right? So we have a lot of people who talk about the resurrection. They're all relatively early. So this means we've got strong source documents for it. Now, many critics discount the Gospels for varying reasons, but that's silly because the Gospels aren't one book, right? They want to say, oh, the Bible, it's one book, but it's not. Right? The Bible is 66 books. Right? You ever pick up a Reader's Digest and you see like the multiple books in it, like the old school abridged Reader's Digest, they had like multiple books in them. Well, that didn't mean, if you read The Count of Monte Cristo, or you pick up an anthology, right? You pick up an anthology by, or about, I don't know, baseball or anything really, right? Just because you read one story and then you flip to a second story, it doesn't make those one book. I mean, it makes them multiple books put into an anthology, which is what the Bible is. It's crazy. So the Gospels are among the primary sources on life and teachings of Jesus. Right? If a historian was to consider it from another person in that century, and they weren't to use the earliest sources, they would not get their highest degree. Like they would not become doctors. They would become, people who did really well at getting master's degree. We've got to remember to use the earliest sources. F.F. Bruce said, one thing must be emphatically stated. New Testament books did not become authoritative for the church because they were formally included in a canonical list. On the contrary, the church included them in her canon because she already regarded them as divinely inspired, recognizing their innate worth and generally apostolic authority, direct or indirect. Right? So we have, we have the Gospels and the books of the New Testament, right? They were considered to be authoritative before they were included in the Bible. The church early on included them and said, yes, this is a good letter. We need to keep this. You find multiple sources throughout time just includes the same 27 books time and time and time again. Some people skip a book here or there, but by and large, in the first 2 centuries, even 3 centuries of the church, you see the same list popping up again and again and again. And that list is what we call the New Testament. Now, in the New Testament, there's this thing called the principle of embarrassment. Now, the principle of embarrassment is kind of cool because it tells us that, hey, these guys are probably telling the truth in what they report, because they're telling the truth about stuff that would make them look foolish or silly. We've got Peter a lot of times sticking his foot in his mouth. We got the disciples, time after time after time, not understanding what Jesus is saying, right? We got Jesus saying, hey, I don't even know when I'm coming back, right? Gary Habermas says it's unlikely that an author would invent an account so as to include the details that are embarrassing and potentially discrediting. Gospel writer states that there's something Jesus does not know. That's in Mark 13:32, the time of his coming. One would think that in an evolving theology where Jesus was assigned a divine status, even of being God himself, statement emphasizing his limitations of knowledge would not have been included, right? If they were making it up, they wouldn't have included this. And that's something kind of cool to look at. But this is why scholars agree that this verse is an actual statement of Jesus. We have multiple sources that say the same thing over and over and over again, right? When you have multiple people, if 2 people see the same car accident, one sees a blue car and one sees a red car, do you then assume that the car accident didn't happen? No. Right. So just because there's little things that are different between the Gospels, does this mean that an event didn't happen? Right. So
Not at all.
let's think the resurrection, right? How many angels were at the tomb? Well, that depends on, when somebody showed up. That depends on what, who wrote it. So we have 1 angel, 2 angels, 3 angels, multitude of angels, right? We don't know. Right? We know there was at least 1. It just depends on who's telling the story and what point of view they're coming from. Because just because I say it was a red car and you're standing across the street and you say it's a blue car, does it mean either of us is wrong? No. What if it had, a red door on the driver's side that replaced it? It's a blue car, but it had a red door on the driver's side. Right. And that's what I saw. And you saw the blue car. Well, then we're both still right. Just because there's a minor discrepancy in our stories doesn't mean that either of us is telling an untruth. Doesn't even mean that either of us is necessarily wrong, because we're telling it from our point of view. It's kind of crazy like that.
I feel like that happens a lot in the world, where people are saying that there's so many different um version of the Bible, so they just choose not to believe at all.
Yeah.
It just doesn't even make sense.
Well, I have a lot of people ask me, why are there so many translations of the Bible? And I was like, okay, do you speak Old English?
Right, exactly.
Well, no. Oh, so I need to have a New English one. Yeah. Said I said, what's a flat? Well, that's something that's like level. I was like, no, it's an apartment. What? No, that's English. So now you're telling me I need at least two Englishes.
Mm-hmm.
And now, do you want to know what the story says? Or do you want to know what the words used were?
Mm-hmm.
You know, oh, because that's two more types of Bibles. I was like, so you can really break it down, and you can get, very quickly, if you take, northern England, in America, right? You use the same words in the north and the south, and you're talking two different languages.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Let alone if you go out to the West Coast and you go into Canada, you go, into England, and you've got, you know, two types of translations for each of them, or even three types of translations for each of them, you know, you end up with, hundreds very quickly. And
Right.
guess what? We have hundreds. You know, they're just different translations. It's what does this word mean? It's not so
Mm-hmm.
black and white when you're looking at ancient Greek,
Right.
right? Because they have what, four words for love that are used in the Bible. So and and then there's people saying, well, the Bible, this person said this and this person says this, and this is a clear contradiction. And no, it's not actually, because it's easily explained. You have two people that are looking at the same thing. Which one's right? Is
Mm-hmm.
either of them right? Which one's wrong? Is either one of them wrong? That can be really hard to tell sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, uh, you know, enemies are testing to what's known in the Bible, right? We have a guy who was out hunting down Christians who all of a sudden, you know, he starts becoming one of them and talking about it. Oh, that's not good for skeptics. Paul is insane like that, right? Because we can look at Paul's testimony and go, he wasn't a Christian, then he became one, right? He wasn't a Christian while Jesus was alive. He became one afterwards, and he was an enemy of the church, and then he is one.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's out there saying, nobody in the first century was saying, yeah, this Paul guy is fake. He was never part of the Sanhedrin. He was never one of us. He was this, right? They don't say any of that. Why? Because Paul really was those things,
Mm-hmm.
right? If your mother says you're an honest person, we may have reason to believe her, yet with reservation, since she loves you and is biased. However, if someone hates you, admits that you're an honest person, we got stronger reason to believe what's being asserted, since that bias doesn't exist, right? The same thing goes for the writers of the Bible, right? We have, you know, we have skeptics that talk about them. We have people who, we have all kinds of things, but it all comes down to this testimony, right? If we look at 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, right, we can see, this creedal statement of, what happened with the crucifixion and death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Right?
Yeah.
I'm going to read from the Holmans just to kind of get us in the right mindset on this. So 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 3. For I pass on to you as utmost importance what I also received. Right? So this is the greatest importance. That Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. That he was buried and he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Then he appeared to over 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. Right? So, he's talking about, we got all these people who saw this. Now, there are skeptics included in that because he goes on to talk about himself. Um, we have people who are, non-Christians who will testify that yes, Jesus was a real person. People did believe that Jesus rose from the dead. They were certain of it. Uh, Gentiles were becoming, you know, conformed to this Christianity. So that, we've got those skeptics. The commitment level of the early church is that they were willing to die for the belief in the resurrection. Was heavily documented in the last one, right? William Lane Craig says, one of the things that surprised me most in doing my doctoral work in Munich on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection was the dawning realization that most historical Jesus scholars who have written on the subject agree that 1. Jesus' burial by Joseph of Arimathea, 2. The discovery of Jesus' empty tomb by some of his female followers, 3. The post-mortem appearances of Jesus to various individuals and groups, and 4. The original disciples coming sincerely to believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, despite their strong predisposition to the contrary, are historical. Right? These are historical things. So scholarship affirms the fatality of the cross. Right? Scholarship affirms the appearances of Jesus. Scholarship affirms the commitment of the disciples, and all of this scholarship serves as a testimony, right? A testimony of the risen Jesus. It says, it seems to me that if Jesus was dead, appeared later to others, and those others were so convinced of it that they were willing to die, then the resurrection is the only reasonable explanation. Right? And even our own testimonies, right? When we look at, our changed lives, who did we used to be? You know, while not necessarily an argument for the existence of Jesus, it's kind of part of, Jesus is still active. He's still active, still alive, still going. But then there are these objections. So the big one is one that I hear a lot of is, don't extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? It's an extraordinary claim if I told you, and you'd never heard of Neil Armstrong, if I told you that there was a guy named Neil Armstrong who walked on the moon. That's a pretty extraordinary claim. Do we have extraordinary evidence for Neil Armstrong walking on the moon? No. We've got ordinary evidence. We've got some video footage. We've got some rocks. We've got some dirt. We've got a flag that's on the moon. Those are all really ordinary things. I could take a video, like we're on a video call. We can take video of anything now, right? Mm-hmm. But in the 60s, they couldn't. So, that's all very ordinary evidence. It's proving something extraordinary, especially if we're talking the late 1960s, right? That's a very extraordinary thing that we're talking about here, So no, it doesn't, and that's also to say that, well, who's gonna say what is an extraordinary claim? And what's extraordinary evidence? Isn't it just evidence? It's either evidence or it's not. That's the thing with that claim, is that it's nonsense, right? So now he kind of breaks it down a little bit, and he says the testimony of man has come into view. We can trust the testimonies recorded in the Gospels because they pass the historical analysis mentioned above. He says, I instruct students to ask those with whom they are witnessing why the Gospels shouldn't be considered reliable in their historical assertions. Depending on how the individual responds, they can demonstrate that the Gospel claims about the resurrection are multiply attested, admitted to by enemies of the faith like Paul, and contain facts that would be embarrassing to the authors. It says, after this, I show them how to demonstrate that the early church had the same testimony. And so when we really look at everything together, right, we look at 1 Corinthians 15, we look at Galatians 1. He says, I instruct students to write Galatians 1:18 so they can easily locate the relevant biblical data. And then being ready with 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. Those are huge. And those show us that very early on, the testimony, even of enemies, was that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead. So, now what we've done is we've looked at the core and we've looked at the fact. And next week, what we're really going to do is kind of break down what all that should lead us to. So, I hope you're ready for next week. But are there any questions before we go?
I don't really have a question.
Huh? Okay.
But
All right, well,
I like the topic though.
I do too.
Yeah, I like the topic.
And if you have any suggestions for what we might do next, I'd be more than willing to hear it. So, but yeah. So, all right. Well, have a good night. Actually, why don't we close in prayer and then we'll